Fatal Vows, the tragic end of a marriage affair, criminal story. Lauren stood at the edge of the hotel balcony, gazing out over the sprawling beach below, the early evening light painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was the perfect scene, a postcard view, the kind that begged to be captured and shared. She had always dreamed of this moment, her honeymoon, the beginning of her life with Eric. The thought of their wedding had filled her with so much excitement, so much promise. They were supposed to be the ideal couple, the ones people admired, envied even. Theirs had been a whirlwind romance, a love story that seemed to be written in the stars. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. But as she looked out at the ocean, Lauren felt a gnawing emptiness deep inside her chest. The beauty of the sunset did little to soothe the discomfort she had been carrying for weeks. Her heart was heavy, weighed down by a secret that she had been hiding from Eric. A secret that, if revealed, would shatter the life they had carefully built together. Lauren and Eric had met years earlier, during their first year at university. She had been drawn to him immediately, his confidence, his charm, and the way he seemed to make everyone around him feel at ease. Eric was the kind of guy who walked into a room and instantly commanded attention, yet somehow managed to make you feel like the most important person there. He had an easy laugh, a disarming smile, and a way of making her feel special, as if she were the only woman in the world. For years, they had been close friends, their bond growing stronger with time, their connection undeniable. They had always been there for each other, through the ups and downs of life, comforting one another during heartbreaks, offering advice, and sharing laughter in the quiet moments. There was an effortless chemistry between them, a magnetic pull that no one could explain. And eventually that chemistry had led to something more. It had taken years for them to finally acknowledge it, to admit that they were in love. Their relationship had progressed naturally, and before they knew it, they were making plans for the future. Engagements, wedding dresses, rings. It all seemed to happen so quickly, as though their lives had been destined to converge at this moment. Their families were thrilled. Their friends couldn't stop talking about how perfect they were for each other. But beneath the surface, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. In the months leading up to their wedding, Lauren had found herself caught in a web of emotions she couldn't control. There had been an affair, a mistake that seemed to come out of nowhere. It had been a fleeting moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment that she had convinced herself would remain a secret. The guilt had eaten at her from the inside out, gnawing away at her until she could hardly breathe. The affair had started innocently enough. One evening, she had run into Mark, an old friend from college. He had been a part of their circle of friends for years, someone Eric knew well. There had never been any hint of attraction between them in the past, but that night something changed. It was late. They were both a little tipsy from wine, and the conversation had turned from casual to something more intimate. One thing had led to another, and before Lauren could stop herself, she had found herself kissing him. The guilt had hit her immediately, but in that moment, it felt like she was somehow free from the weight of expectations that had been placed on her shoulders. The affair had lasted only a few weeks, but those weeks had been enough to plant a seed of doubt in Lauren's mind. She had stopped seeing Mark after the first time she slept with him, realizing how deeply she had betrayed Eric. And yet, even though she had cut it off before the wedding, the weight of her actions stayed with her. She had tried to suppress the shame, to convince herself that it hadn't meant anything, but as the days and weeks passed, it became impossible to ignore the truth. Now, sitting alone on the balcony of their honeymoon suite, Lauren knew that she could no longer keep this secret. The guilt had become unbearable, and she had to tell Eric. She had to confess, even if it meant losing everything. The thought of his reaction made her stomach twist in knots. What would he say? Would he be able to forgive her? Would he even want to try? The air was thick with anticipation as the evening wore on. Below, the sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing, but it did little to calm her racing heart. She had always prided herself on being honest, but the thought of shattering Eric's trust, of telling him something that would destroy their relationship, was almost too much to bear. How could she explain something that she herself didn't fully understand? How could she make him see that it had been a momentary lapse in judgment, something that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things? Eric, for his part, had no idea what Lauren was battling internally. He had always been the optimist in their relationship, the one who believed in happy endings, the one who could always see the silver lining. He was the one who held on to the belief that love could conquer all, that the two of them would weather any storm together. Their wedding had been a beautiful celebration of that belief. The ceremony had been magical, the vows exchanged heartfelt and sincere. They had promised to love and cherish each other through thick and thin, for better or for worse. And now, as Lauren prepared to break that promise, she couldn't help but feel that everything they had built was crumbling beneath her feet. Would he be able to forgive her? Would he still love her after hearing the truth? Or would this one revelation be enough to destroy everything? She wanted to be the woman he thought she was, the one who would stand by him, who would support him through anything. But she had failed him, and she had no idea how to fix it. After a few moments of quiet reflection, Lauren made her decision. She would tell him. She would confess the truth, no matter how painful it was. There was no other choice. If she didn't, the guilt would continue to eat away at her, and their marriage would never be whole. But what Lauren didn't realize in that moment was that her decision would be the first step in a series of events that would spiral far beyond her control. With a heavy heart, she stood up from the balcony, took one last look at the view, and walked back into the hotel suite. Eric was sitting at the small dining table, flipping through a brochure about local attractions, his face illuminated by the soft light of the lamp beside him. He looked up as she entered, offering her a warm smile. "You okay?" he asked, sensing that something was off. Lauren's throat tightened as she walked toward him. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. Eric's expression changed immediately, his brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" he asked, his tone soft, but the edge of worry beginning to creep into his voice. Taking a deep breath, Lauren sat down across from him. This was it, the moment that would change everything. "Before we got married, I had an affair," she whispered, barely able to meet his eyes. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, like an unspoken curse. Eric's face froze. The smile that had once graced his lips faltered, and his eyes widened in shock. He didn't speak at first, as if he hadn't fully processed what she had said. "I'm so sorry," Lauren continued, her voice barely audible. "It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake. It was a brief moment of weakness, and I ended it before the wedding. But I can't keep it from you anymore. I have to tell you the truth." Eric's gaze shifted from her to the table, then back to her, his expression one of disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped, as if unsure of what to say. A million thoughts seemed to race through his mind, but nothing came out. The silence between them was suffocating, and Lauren's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for his reaction. Finally, Eric looked at her, his voice strained. "Why now?" "Why tell me this now?" he asked, the hurt in his eyes already evident. "Why not before we got married? Why wait until we're here, on our honeymoon?" Lauren swallowed hard, the weight of her confession still pressing down on her. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said softly. "I was scared. I thought maybe I could just forget about it, move on. But I can't. I need you to know." Eric stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He turned away from her, his back to her as he walked toward the window. The cool breeze from the ocean drifted in, carrying the scent of salt water, but the air in the room felt suffocating. He didn't say anything for a long time. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, like an invisible wall that separated them. Finally, he turned to face her, his face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, his voice tight, as though the words themselves hurt to say. Lauren's heart broke at the question. She stood up to go to him, but Eric took a step back. His eyes searched hers, looking for something, an explanation, an excuse, but there was none. "How could you do this?" he whispered, the pain in his voice palpable. "How could you betray me like this?" Lauren opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She could feel the tears welling in her eyes, threatening to spill over, but she couldn't bring herself to let them fall. This was her punishment, this moment, this silence. She had destroyed everything they had. And now, there was no turning back. The night air had cooled by the time Lauren and Eric made their way to the resort's intimate dining room, a quiet space tucked away from the main hotel where they could enjoy a private dinner, just the two of them. The staff had made every effort to make their honeymoon feel magical, from the fragrant candles on their table to the soft, romantic music playing in the background. Eric, ever the optimist, was in high spirits, his infectious smile lighting up the room as he made playful jokes, joking about how the waiter had been overly enthusiastic with the wine pairing and how the ocean view had reminded him of a film he had seen as a child. Lauren smiled politely, her heart heavy as she forced herself to laugh at the right moments, but the truth was, the laughter felt hollow. She had expected to feel lighter after her confession, after the relief of finally telling Eric the truth. But instead, the burden of her admission sat like a stone in her chest, unyielding and suffocating. Every word of their conversation felt like a performance, every moment of joy a cruel mockery of the pain she carried. Eric didn't seem to notice. He was too absorbed in the contentment of their honeymoon, too eager to create memories that would last a lifetime. And yet, the weight of what Lauren had just revealed lingered between them like a thick fog, something that neither could articulate but both could feel. The confession had left her feeling vulnerable in a way she had never experienced before. It was as if she had stripped away the last semblance of protection she had, her ability to keep her darkest secrets hidden. The guilt of her affair with Mark, a man she had once considered a close friend, had become unbearable. It wasn't that she hadn't tried to suppress it. She had convinced herself that it was a mistake that didn't matter, something that would fade into the past as they moved forward with their lives. She had told herself that love could overcome anything, that their connection was strong enough to weather any storm. But now, with Eric sitting across from her, his laughter ringing in her ears, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had believed about their perfect relationship was a lie. It wasn't that she didn't love Eric. No, that was never in question. She loved him deeply. She always had. But the affair had introduced a sharp crack in the foundation of their relationship, a crack that, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she couldn't repair. She had tried to move past it, to convince herself that once they were married, once they were truly committed, the past would no longer matter. But as the days passed, it became clear that it wasn't something she could just erase. She had betrayed him in the most fundamental way, and there was no undoing that. As they sat in the softly lit restaurant, the waitstaff having placed their meals in front of them, Lauren's mind raced. She couldn't stop replaying the moment when she had told Eric the truth, the way his face had fallen when he heard the words, "I had an affair." His disbelief had been almost palpable, and the questions that followed, those that tore at the very fabric of their relationship, had left her feeling exposed. "Why now? Why tell me this now?" he had asked. And what could she have said in response? It was the question that had haunted her since she first met Mark, since the first time she let her emotions get tangled with someone else. There was no logical explanation, no valid justification for what she had done. She had allowed herself to be weak, to make a decision that could destroy everything. Eric hadn't reacted as she had expected. She had feared anger, perhaps even rage, but what she saw in his eyes when he first heard the confession was a kind of devastating hurt, the kind that no amount of apologies could ever fix. She had hoped that by confessing, she would relieve herself of the guilt, that she would purge the dark secret that had been weighing her down. But instead, it had only made everything worse. Now, as the dinner progressed, she could feel his distance. His attention was scattered, his responses automatic, as if he was still processing the shock of her confession. At times, he would smile faintly, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. There were long pauses in their conversation, moments when Eric would stare off into the distance, lost in his thoughts, perhaps trying to figure out what to make of the bombshell she had dropped. Lauren's heart ached at every silence, every moment that she could feel the space growing between them. She longed for him to reach out, to say something, anything, to let her know that there was still a chance for them. But there was nothing. As the evening drew on, Lauren's unease grew. The tension between them was palpable. She tried to ease the discomfort by making light of the situation, asking about the next day's activities, suggesting they take a walk on the beach after dinner, but Eric's responses were distant, his words lacking the warmth that had once flowed so easily between them. The evening, which had begun with such promise, was slowly unraveling. Lauren had always prided herself on her honesty. It was something she valued above all else in her relationships, especially with Eric. She had never kept secrets from him before, never felt the need to hide anything. When they had met in college, their friendship had been founded on openness and trust. They had shared their fears, their dreams, and even their disappointments without hesitation. When they began dating, it felt like the most natural progression of what had always been a deep connection. They had made promises to each other, to be open, to always be truthful, no matter how difficult it might be. She had believed, with all her heart, that they could face anything together. And yet here she was, sitting across from him, her mind spiraling with shame and regret. As she stared at her plate, barely touching her food, Lauren's thoughts turned inward. She had allowed herself to fall into a pattern of justification, of rationalizing what had happened with Mark. It had started so innocently, she told herself. They were both vulnerable, lonely in a way that neither had fully understood at the time. Mark had been there for her during a difficult period when Eric had been caught up in work, when they were both distracted by the pressures of wedding planning. She had needed someone to lean on, someone who could make her feel desirable, wanted. The affair, as she now understood, had been a desperate attempt to fill a void that had always been present in her life, but had become more pronounced as the wedding approached. The guilt had consumed her every day since. It wasn't just that she had betrayed Eric, it was the fact that she had lied to herself, too. She had convinced herself that the affair had been a meaningless distraction, that it hadn't been anything more than a brief lapse in judgment. But deep down, she knew the truth, that the affair had exposed something deep inside her that she wasn't ready to face. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a reflection of a deeper dissatisfaction, a fear that maybe she wasn't ready for the kind of commitment marriage demanded. She wasn't ready to be someone's everything. She wasn't sure if she was ready to be the woman Eric needed her to be. But now it was too late. The truth had come out, and the consequences were far greater than she had ever imagined. She had hoped, foolishly, that revealing the truth would somehow fix everything, that it would allow them to start anew, to rebuild their foundation on honesty and transparency. But Eric's pain was evident in the way he held back, in the way his eyes darted away when she tried to meet his gaze. The trust between them had been shattered, and she wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. The dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and awkward silences. As the dessert course was placed in front of them, something rich and decadent that Lauren could barely bring herself to taste, she looked at Eric, searching for any sign of the man she had fallen in love with. His jaw was clenched, his eyes distant, and his smile, when it appeared, was so faint it hardly seemed real. It was then that she realized the full weight of what she had done. It wasn't just the affair, it was everything that had led up to it, everything that had been left unsaid. They had spent so many years building their lives together, believing in a version of love that she had now broken, and no amount of apologies would change that. Later, as they walked back to their hotel room, the silence between them was deafening. The soft click of their footsteps against the marble floor was the only sound, a stark contrast to the hum of the bustling resort. Eric's hand brushed against hers as they walked, but it was fleeting, not the familiar touch she had come to expect. She reached out to him, her fingers lightly grazing his, but he didn't hold her hand, didn't even seem to notice. The realization hit her like a wave. This was it. The life they had known was over. All she could do now was wait for the fallout, and she feared that there was no coming back from it. The next morning arrived with an oppressive heaviness in the air. The sun rose over the ocean, casting pale light over the world, but Lauren felt as though the world had gone still. It was as though time had slowed, the beauty of the resort now a cruel juxtaposition to the turmoil churning inside her. She woke to the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, a steady, rhythmic noise that used to bring her peace. Now, it felt like an ominous reminder of how far away she had drifted from everything that had once felt safe and familiar. Eric had barely said a word to her since the night before. After their awkward dinner, they had returned to their suite, where he had retreated to the bathroom, leaving Lauren alone in the dimly lit room. She had tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was the expression on Eric's face when he first heard the truth. The confusion, the disbelief, those moments had burned themselves into her memory, and now they replayed over and over again in her mind, each time more excruciating than the last. She could still remember his voice when he asked her, "Did you ever love me?" The raw pain in his question had cut deeper than any physical wound. And though she had tried to explain, to make him understand that it had been a mistake, something she regretted deeply, she knew that no explanation could fix what she had done. The trust they had built, the years they had spent together, seemed to dissolve in the air between them like smoke, slipping through her fingers no matter how hard she tried to hold on. That morning, as Lauren woke, she found Eric already up. He was sitting at the small balcony overlooking the ocean, his back to her. He had dressed in the same casual shorts and t-shirt he had worn the day before, but now they seemed to hang on him like a costume. The man she had married was gone, replaced by someone unfamiliar, someone distant, someone who seemed to be carrying a burden that Lauren had placed on his shoulders. It was in that moment that Lauren realized the full weight of the unfamiliar situation she now found herself in. She had thought that after confessing the truth, she would feel lighter, relieved even. But instead, the air around her had thickened, and the silence between them had grown unbearable. It was as though every word that might have passed between them had been swallowed up by an invisible chasm, one neither of them could cross. They had entered new territory, an emotional landscape neither of them knew how to navigate. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little they both knew about the other's vulnerabilities, how fragile their connection truly was. At first, it was the small things that unsettled her. Eric had always been open with his emotions, quick to share how he felt. He was the kind of person who wore his heart on his sleeve. But now, as he sat at the balcony, he seemed lost in himself, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as though he was searching for an answer in the empty expanse of ocean. Lauren wasn't sure whether he was angry with her, disappointed, or simply confused. All she knew was that the man she had married, the man who had made her feel secure and cherished, was a stranger now. For a moment, Lauren considered going to him, sitting beside him, and offering words of comfort, anything to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But as she watched him, she realized that he was too far removed. The wall between them had already gone up, and she wasn't sure how to tear it down. She wasn't sure if she could. Minutes passed, stretching into an eternity. Lauren's stomach churned with unease, the silence between them an insufferable weight. When Eric finally stood, it was with a slow, deliberate motion, as if he were trying to gather the strength to face something that neither of them could escape. "Lauren," he said, his voice low and hoarse, as though the simple act of speaking took effort. He turned toward her, his face unreadable. "We need to talk." Lauren nodded, her throat dry as she stood from the bed.
She didn't know what to say.
She had spent the entire night rehearsing her apology in her head, over and over again, but none of it felt right. How could she explain her actions? How could she make him understand that she wasn't a bad person, that the affair had been a mistake? And yet, even as she tried to muster the right words, she knew the truth. No explanation could undo the damage she had caused. They made their way to the small, private seating area by the window, where Eric gestured for her to sit first. As she did, she watched him pace back and forth in the small space, his hands shoved into his pockets, his jaw clenched. The tension in his body was palpable, his every movement an expression of the turmoil raging inside him. He was struggling, trying to come to terms with what she had done, and Lauren could see it in the way his eyes flickered between her and the floor. "How long?" Eric finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but steady, almost cold. Lauren swallowed. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she already knew what he was asking. "How long was it going on?" he pressed. His eyes bore into hers, searching for answers. "Before the wedding. Before you told me." Lauren's heart sank, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. How could she possibly answer that question? How could she quantify the betrayal? "A few weeks," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "It didn't mean anything, Eric. I swear." Eric looked at her, his face a mix of disbelief and sorrow. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. "I don't know what to say, Lauren," Eric finally said, his voice breaking slightly. "I trusted you. I thought we were building something real, something that would last." Lauren felt the sting of his words. She had betrayed his trust in the most fundamental way. "Eric, I never meant for it to happen. It was a mistake. A horrible mistake. And I've regretted it every day since. But I need you to understand, it wasn't because of something wrong with us. It wasn't about you. It was me. I was the one who messed up. I let myself get lost in something that didn't matter, and now I'm paying the price. I know I hurt you, and I can never take that back." Eric's expression softened slightly, but the pain in his eyes was still there, raw and unhealed. "But why?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. "Why did you do it? Why would you risk everything we've built? I don't get it.
You said you loved me.
How does this fit into that?" The question hit Lauren like a slap to the face. It was the question she had been avoiding, the question she hadn't wanted to answer, even to herself. The truth was ugly, and even now, as the words formed in her mind, she hesitated to say them out loud. But there was no escaping it. I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I thought I was scared, Eric. I thought maybe I wasn't ready for everything that we were about to do, everything that was expected of me. Marriage, a lifetime commitment. I felt trapped. And I made a mistake. I thought if I could prove to myself that I could still be desired, still be wanted, it would make everything feel okay. But it didn't. It just made everything worse." She paused, wiping away a tear that had escaped without warning. "I wasn't ready for the responsibility of loving someone fully, of being your partner, in every way. And instead of talking to you, instead of being honest about how I was feeling, I ran away. I ran to someone who made me feel something, anything other than fear. But I hurt you, and I am so sorry." Eric didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at her, his face still unreadable. Then, slowly, he sank into the chair beside her. The weight of his presence seemed heavier than before, but in the silence that followed, Lauren realized that something had changed. The confession, the honesty they had both been avoiding, had cracked the veneer of their perfect life. And though she didn't know if this was the beginning of healing, or if it would all unravel from here, she knew one thing. They were in uncharted waters now. Nothing would ever be the same again. Eric took a deep breath, and for the first time that day, he looked at her, not with anger, not with sorrow, but with something else. Something unreadable. He was no longer the man she had known before. They were both someone new, standing on the precipice of a future neither of them understood. "I need time, Lauren," Eric said softly. "I need time to think." Lauren nodded, the lump in her throat growing larger. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in a long time, she had no illusions about what their future might look like. She didn't know if they would make it through this, if their love could survive. But she knew that their marriage had been irrevocably changed, and they had both entered a situation that neither of them could control. The unfamiliarity of it all pressed in on her once again. The silence that followed felt heavier than ever. The days that followed were a blur of half-spoken words and awkward silences. The reality of their situation was undeniable, and yet neither Lauren nor Eric seemed fully equipped to deal with it. They had been thrust into an emotional storm, and while they both knew that things could never go back to the way they were, they also knew they couldn't simply walk away. Their marriage, their love, had been built on a foundation of trust that Lauren had shattered, and which Eric was struggling to rebuild. Lauren had hoped that after their difficult conversation, something would change, that maybe they would begin the slow and painful process of healing. But nothing was simple. There was no roadmap for how to repair something this broken, and even as the days passed, the chasm between them only seemed to widen. They were no longer just husband and wife. They were strangers bound by a shared history, a shared pain. The weight of it all was suffocating, and Lauren found herself drowning in the silence. Eric had distanced himself, retreating into himself in ways Lauren had never seen before. He was still present physically, still there in the mornings when she woke up, still there when they ate, but he wasn't really there. His eyes were always distant, his words short and measured. When they spoke, it felt as though he were talking to her from the other side of a thick glass, separated by something that neither of them could see, but both of them could feel. The closeness they had once shared was gone, and in its place was a profound sense of isolation. At first, Lauren tried to fill the silence. She would talk about the resort, about their plans for the day, about trivial things, anything to fill the gaps in their conversation. But Eric's responses were always curt, his attention always elsewhere. When she asked how he was feeling, he would nod or mutter something vague, but he never truly engaged. And each time this happened, the realization hit Lauren harder. He was shutting her out. But Lauren wasn't ready to give up, not yet. She still loved Eric, and though she knew she had done something unforgivable, she was desperate to make things right. She needed him to see that the woman sitting next to him was still the same woman he had married, the woman who had shared every dream and secret with him. But now, she had to navigate the shifting tides of their relationship, trying to find a way to break through the walls he had built around himself. On the fourth morning after her confession, Lauren woke early, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The room was dim, the soft light of dawn creeping in through the balcony doors. She could hear the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore, but it was a sound she barely noticed anymore, drowned out by the noise inside her head. She had tried everything she could think of to bridge the gap between them. She had suggested they go for a walk on the beach, to sit by the water and just talk, but Eric had declined, saying he needed some time to think. She had tried to show him affection, offering gentle touches or sweet words, but each time, he had recoiled, as if her very presence reminded him of the betrayal. That morning, Lauren made a decision. She couldn't keep going like this. She couldn't keep pretending that everything would work itself out, that time would magically heal the wounds between them. She needed to confront the situation head-on. She needed to show Eric that she was still the woman he had married, that the love they had shared wasn't entirely lost. But to do that, she knew she needed to change, to adapt to this new reality where their relationship could no longer exist as it had before. Lauren stood up and walked to the small kitchenette in their suite, her bare feet silent on the cool floor. The room was quiet, and for a moment, she just stood there, gathering her thoughts. She glanced at Eric, who was sitting in the same chair he had occupied for the past few days, staring at the ocean again. He hadn't moved. His face was a mask of exhaustion, the lines on his forehead etched deeply from the stress and confusion he had been carrying. She took a deep breath, then began to prepare coffee, hoping that the simple act of making something familiar might help to settle her mind. It was a small, domestic gesture, but in the context of the emotional war zone they were living in, it felt like the only thing she could control. As she prepared the coffee, her thoughts continued to race. She needed to apologize again, to tell him the full depth of her remorse. But she also needed to give him space, needed to let him process the pain in his own time. The trick, she realized, was finding balance. When the coffee was ready, Lauren poured 2 cups and carried them to the small table near the window. She placed 1 cup in front of Eric, who had yet to acknowledge her presence. He didn't even look up as she sat down across from him, but she could feel his awareness of her. "Eric," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion, "I don't want to keep pretending that things are okay. Because they're not. But I need you to know that I am so sorry. And I know that doesn't make things better. I know it can't undo what I did. But I need you to understand how deeply I regret hurting you. I never meant for it to happen. I was weak, and I made a choice that I will regret for the rest of my life." Eric didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the coffee in front of him. But after a moment, he slowly looked up at her, his eyes dark, filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "You keep saying you're sorry," he said quietly, "but I don't think you understand what you've done. I don't think you understand how much this has changed everything. I don't know who you are anymore, Lauren. I don't know who I am anymore." The words hit Lauren like a punch to the gut. She had been expecting anger, yes, but hearing him say those words, he didn't know who she was anymore, shattered something inside her. She had wanted to believe that their love was strong enough to survive this, but now she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure about anything. "I know," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know who I am anymore either. But I'm trying. I'm trying to be the person you deserve. I'm trying to find my way back to you." Eric's face softened slightly, but only for a moment. "I need time, Lauren," he said, his voice barely audible. "I need to think about everything. I need to figure out if I can forgive you." Lauren nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been hoping for some kind of breakthrough, but it was clear now that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. Their marriage was in ruins, and even though she desperately wanted to repair it, she had to accept that it might not be possible. The next few days unfolded in a tense silence. Lauren tried to give Eric the space he needed, but it was impossible to ignore the constant tension in the air. They spent most of their time apart, Eric taking long walks on the beach, sometimes retreating to a nearby cafe, while Lauren stayed in their suite, pacing restlessly, trying to come to terms with the uncertainty of everything. She found herself constantly second-guessing her actions, replaying every moment, wondering if she had done something differently. Could it have saved them? But deep down, she knew that there was no going back. She couldn't undo what she had done. The best she could do now was be patient, give Eric the space he needed, and hope that in time, they could rebuild whatever had been lost. But even as she struggled to adapt to this new reality, something inside her shifted. The rawness of the situation had stripped her down to the core, and in the process, she began to see herself in a new light. She realized that her actions weren't just about her relationship with Eric. They were a reflection of her own fears and insecurities, the things she had buried for so long. The affair had been a manifestation of her fear of commitment, of her fear of being truly vulnerable with someone. But it was also a wake-up call, a moment of clarity. She had allowed herself to get lost in a fleeting distraction, and in doing so, she had sacrificed the one thing that truly mattered, her connection to the person she loved most in the world. And so, she resolved to change. She couldn't change the past, but she could change how she moved forward. The question was no longer about whether Eric would forgive her. It was about whether she could forgive herself, and whether she could become the person capable of building a future based on honesty and vulnerability. It was clear now that their marriage, as it had been, was gone. But perhaps, in the ashes of their old life, there was the possibility of something new, something stronger, more authentic. Whether they could find it together, or whether they would walk away from each other, she didn't know. But what she did know was that she had to adapt, to change, to embrace the painful lessons that this experience had forced upon her. As she stared out at the ocean, the horizon stretched before her, vast and infinite. And though the future seemed uncertain, she knew one thing: she couldn't keep living in the past. Whatever lay ahead, she had to face it. And she had to do it alone, at least for now. The day had arrived. The weight of the past 2 weeks, of silences, stilted conversations, and the deep, palpable ache between them, had pushed Lauren to a tipping point. She had waited, hoped, and prayed for some sign that their marriage could be salvaged. But no sign had come, no revelation that would light the way forward. Eric remained distant, absorbed in his own quiet turmoil. And while Lauren understood his need for time and space, she knew that time was running out. The more they lingered in the limbo of their fractured relationship, the less certain she became of their future together. In some ways, it felt as though the confession, the guilt, and the heavy silence had done its damage irreparably. Yet, at the same time, Lauren's determination had only grown stronger. There was something buried deep within her, something instinctual, a flicker of hope that refused to let go of the idea that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. But if they were ever going to fix the brokenness between them, she needed to do something drastic. Lauren had spent the last few days obsessively thinking about how she could reach Eric. Every apology, every tearful confession had been met with a wall of resistance. The more she had tried to explain herself, the more he had pulled away. No, she realized she could no longer beg for forgiveness. She could no longer wait for him to come to her. If she wanted to salvage anything, if she wanted their marriage to survive, she needed to show him, rather than tell him, how much she was willing to fight for them. The morning that changed everything was quiet and ordinary, a strange contrast to the tension that simmered beneath the surface. As usual, Eric was in the small corner by the balcony, the one place he'd started to claim for himself. His face was unreadable as he stared out at the ocean, his coffee cup perched idly in his hand. The sun had only just risen, casting soft golden light across the still, glassy water, but the silence between them was thick. Lauren had been awake for hours, sitting on the edge of the bed, mentally preparing herself for what she knew was about to happen. She stood, her breath caught in her throat, and moved toward him. "Eric," she said, her voice trembling, yet determined. It was the first time she had truly addressed him since their last confrontation, the last time she had offered him an explanation. She didn't know if he would even respond, but this was it. This was her final attempt. If it didn't work, then she would have to accept the reality that their relationship might truly be over. He didn't look up at first, but the tension in the air shifted. Slowly, he placed the coffee cup down on the table, his movements slow, deliberate. His gaze met hers, and for the first time in weeks, she saw something in his eyes that was not cold indifference or quiet anger. It was uncertainty.
Fear.
She recognized it immediately. "I know you've been trying to give me space," she began, her voice soft but firm. "And I get it, Eric. You need time. But I can't keep pretending that I'm okay with where we are. I can't keep waiting for things to fix themselves because I know that won't happen. If I want us to have a chance, I have to stop hiding from what happened, stop pretending like I didn't destroy everything we had. And I need you to see that I'm willing to do anything to earn your trust back. I love you, Eric. I want to prove it to you." Eric's eyes narrowed slightly, and Lauren's stomach twisted in knots. She knew he had been expecting her to break down again, to apologize for what felt like the 100th time. But this time it was different. This time, she wasn't asking for his forgiveness. She was showing him, showing herself, that she was capable of fighting for what they had lost. "Lauren," he said, his voice low, guarded. "I don't know what you want from me. I don't know how you expect me to just move past this." "I'm not asking you to move past it," she replied, her hands trembling at her sides. "I know that's not possible. But I am asking you to see that I'm not the same person I was when I made that mistake. I've learned, Eric. I've learned the hard way. And I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make things right. But I need you to meet me halfway. Please." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. Lauren could see the conflict in his eyes, the push and pull of his emotions. He wanted to forgive her, but something in him was still afraid to let go of the anger, still afraid to trust her again. She couldn't blame him. She had betrayed him in the worst way possible. But she couldn't wait any longer, not with the heavy burden of their silence hanging over them. She needed him to understand, to see that she was willing to change, to fight for their marriage, and that meant she had to stop being passive.
She had to take control.
"I don't know what this is going to look like," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm not walking away from this. And if that means I have to be patient, if that means I have to prove myself to you every single day for the rest of my life, then I will. I just need you to take that first step with me, Eric." She held her breath, waiting for his response, praying that he would see the sincerity in her eyes. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, putting herself so fully out there, but she couldn't live in the waiting anymore. She couldn't pretend that things would magically get better on their own. She had to act. Eric stood then, slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. His expression was still unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that gave Lauren a glimmer of hope. He took a step toward her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They were standing on the edge of something fragile and delicate. She wasn't sure if this was a turning point, or if it was the final, irrevocable moment that would break them beyond repair. But then, unexpectedly, Eric reached out. His hand brushed against hers, tentative at first, as if he was unsure of what it meant to touch her again, unsure if he had the right to do so. But Lauren held on to him, her hand trembling as she intertwined her fingers with his. The simple act of touch sent a rush of relief through her, a reminder that their connection had never been entirely lost. It wasn't over yet. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Lauren," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know that I'm not ready to give up on us. Not yet." A tear slipped down Lauren's cheek, and she didn't try to hide it. "That's all I need, Eric. I don't need you to forgive me today. I just need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in what felt like forever, the walls between them began to crack. The silence was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating. They weren't whole again, not by any means, but something had shifted. Something small, something fragile, but real. Later that afternoon, they walked along the beach together, side by side, not speaking much, but the quiet was comfortable now. They were navigating the aftermath of something that couldn't be undone, something that had changed them both irrevocably. But for the first time, there was a sense of movement, of forward motion. The wounds hadn't healed, and the path ahead was still uncertain, but they were moving together. Slowly, cautiously, but together. Lauren knew that this moment wasn't a victory, not in the traditional sense. She hadn't won Eric's heart back with a single conversation. The trust between them hadn't been restored overnight, and the deep scars of betrayal weren't going to vanish with a simple apology. But for the first time in weeks, there was hope, and with that hope came the realization that maybe, just maybe, they could build something stronger out of the rubble. It would take time. It would take patience. But it was a beginning, and that was enough for now. In this section, Lauren decides to take a more proactive role in attempting to save her marriage. She realizes that waiting passively for Eric to forgive her or fix things will not work, and instead, she confronts him directly, laying her heart bare. Her willingness to act, to fight for their relationship, is a pivotal turning point, and though there are no immediate resolutions, her efforts lead to a small, hopeful shift in their dynamic. This section highlights the internal shift Lauren undergoes as she moves from regret and passivity to determination and action. It also illustrates the fragile and tentative nature of their reconciliation, marking the beginning of the painful and uncertain journey of rebuilding their relationship. The days that followed their tentative reconnection felt like a series of fragile, small steps towards something they both weren't sure could ever be rebuilt. But despite the glimmer of hope that had emerged between them, Lauren couldn't shake the sense that their relationship was teetering on a precipice, that it was only a matter of time before the weight of their brokenness would crush the delicate truce they had struck. Every word she spoke, every moment she spent with Eric, felt as though it could either strengthen the fragile bridge between them or send them tumbling into the abyss. Lauren had hoped that the silence between them would eventually break, that the raw honesty she had offered would clear the air, allowing them to move forward. But as the days passed, she came to realize that nothing could erase the deep wound that her affair had left in their marriage. They were walking on eggshells, both of them unsure how to navigate the complex web of guilt, anger, and unresolved emotions. The shadow of betrayal was never far away, always lurking just beneath the surface of every conversation, every touch. Lauren's efforts to demonstrate her commitment to Eric were met with varying degrees of acceptance. At times, he seemed to soften, as if willing to give her a second chance. At others, the cold distance returned, as though the walls he had built around himself were too high to be breached. The back and forth left Lauren feeling like she was on an emotional roller coaster, each high followed by a devastating low, each step forward followed by 2 steps back. But it wasn't just the distance between them that left her feeling unmoored. It was the emotional toll that the entire situation was taking on both of them. Eric was no longer the man she had married. He had changed. His anger simmered just beneath the surface, always there, threatening to erupt at any moment. There were days when he would withdraw completely, retreating into a cold silence, avoiding her as if she were a stranger. Then, there were moments when he would turn to her, asking if she still loved him, or if she thought they could ever rebuild their lives together. It was these moments that cut her the deepest, the times when he would ask if she was truly capable of loving him again, or if she was simply going through the motions, trying to fix what had been broken beyond repair. The questions were like daggers, aimed at her heart, forcing her to confront the truth. She didn't know if they could ever go back to what they had before. She wanted to, more than anything, but the path was filled with so many obstacles that it seemed impossible. Still, she tried. She tried to show him, with every action, every word, that she was committed to their marriage, that she was ready to work through the pain, no matter how long it took. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally broken. The marriage they had shared, the one built on trust and shared dreams, felt irreparably shattered. And though Lauren still believed in the possibility of rebuilding something new between them, she was beginning to understand that there was no quick fix, no magical moment when everything would suddenly snap back into place. One evening, as they sat across from each other at a small restaurant on the beach, the tension between them was palpable. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the water, but it felt as though the darkness between them was deeper than anything the fading light could illuminate. Eric had been uncharacteristically quiet all evening, his gaze fixed on the waves crashing in the distance, and Lauren couldn't help but wonder what was going on inside his mind. "Eric," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Talk to me. I feel like we're stuck. We've been doing this dance for weeks, and I don't know where it's taking us anymore." Eric didn't look at her right away, his eyes still focused on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I'm not sure what you want from me, Lauren. I want to believe that we can move past this, that we can rebuild. But I don't know how. I don't know if I even want it anymore." The words hit Lauren like a slap. She hadn't been prepared for the rawness in his voice, the honesty that seemed to rip open the carefully constructed walls he had been hiding behind. It was as if his confession, his admission of doubt, was a final blow to everything she had been working toward. In that moment, she realized just how much damage had been done, not just by the affair, but by the emotional toll of living in limbo, of constantly questioning the future of their relationship. "I'm trying, Eric," she whispered, her throat tightening with emotion. "I'm trying so hard, but I can't keep doing this alone. If you're not ready to try, then maybe we should just admit that we're broken, that we can't go back to what we were." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncertain. For a long time, Eric didn't say anything. He simply stared at her, his eyes dark and distant, as if he were weighing something inside himself. And then, slowly, almost as though it were a painful revelation, he spoke again. "Maybe we're already too far gone. Maybe we can't fix this, Lauren." The words felt like a knife to the heart. For a moment, Lauren couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. All the work she had put into rebuilding their trust, all the late-night conversations, all the small gestures meant to heal the wounds, it felt meaningless in the face of Eric's words. They were words she had been dreading, words that confirmed her worst fear, that their marriage was beyond saving. But instead of breaking down, instead of crying or pleading, something inside Lauren shifted. She realized that there was no more running from the reality of their situation. She had been living in a state of denial, convincing herself that things would somehow get better, that time would heal their wounds. But time wasn't enough. The damage was too deep, and no amount of apologies, no amount of effort, could undo the betrayal. The truth was, Eric didn't trust her anymore. He didn't believe that she could love him the way he needed to be loved. And no matter how much she wished otherwise, she couldn't change that. She had made the choice to step outside their marriage, and in doing so, she had irreparably altered the course of their lives. It was a harsh reality to face, but Lauren knew that it was the only way forward. The cost of her actions was too high, and the emotional toll of trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed was unbearable. She had wanted to believe that they could rebuild, that they could heal together. But the price of that hope was too steep. In the days that followed, Lauren and Eric became strangers to each other. The tension between them only deepened, and the conversations they had were filled with bitterness and resignation. Eric continued to pull away, and Lauren found herself retreating as well, unsure of how to navigate the pain and guilt that weighed heavily on her heart. The tipping point came one night, just a few days later, when Eric came to her with a decision that shattered whatever fragile hope Lauren had left. He told her that he needed space, more than just physical space, but emotional distance. He couldn't continue living in a marriage where trust was no longer possible, where every interaction felt like a reminder of the betrayal that had torn them apart. "I think we need time apart, Lauren," he said, his voice barely audible. "I need to figure out if there's even a future for us. If I can even look at you and see the woman I married." The words stung more than anything he had said before, and in that moment, Lauren realized the full weight of what she had lost. There was no more hope left to cling to. Eric's heart had been irreparably broken, and no amount of love or effort could fix it. She had tried. She had fought with everything she had, but in the end, the damage was too deep. As Eric left the room that night, Lauren sat alone, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and regret. She had gotten what she had wanted. Eric had acknowledged that he wasn't ready to give up, that he wasn't willing to walk away just yet. But the price of that admission was too high. They were both paying the price for her mistakes, and neither of them knew how to stop the emotional bleeding. For Lauren, the cost of getting what she wanted, the hope, the possibility of reconciliation, was the realization that it wasn't enough. She had hoped for healing, for a return to the love they once shared. But the truth was, they had both been irrevocably changed, and there was no going back. In the end, the price was not just her marriage, but the innocence of a future that could never be. The morning after Eric's departure, when the full weight of their separation hung heavily in the air, Lauren woke up to an unfamiliar silence. The kind of silence that feels suffocating. It was no longer just the absence of Eric's presence in the room. It was the absence of hope, the absence of everything she had fought for. The fragile connection they had briefly revived during their difficult conversations now felt like a distant memory, a mirage that had evaporated in the heat of reality. Lauren sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The empty side of the bed where Eric had slept, the carefully folded clothes in the corner of the room that had once held promise of a future together, the small details of their life that once felt so normal. Everything now seemed strangely out of place. The world had shifted overnight, and Lauren found herself on the other side of a door she had never intended to open. The realization had hit her like a hammer. Their marriage was over. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with the quiet resignation of two people who had run out of time, energy, and, perhaps most tragically, love. She stared at the walls around her, as though they would somehow offer her the answers she sought. But the room was silent, indifferent to her pain. It was a hollow space now, a stark reminder of everything she had lost. She had thought that love would be enough, that time and effort would heal the wounds, but the truth had become undeniable. No amount of apology, no amount of effort on her part could change the fact that Eric had made up his mind. He needed space, not just physical space, but emotional distance, a reprieve from the constant reminder of betrayal. And though Lauren had desperately hoped they could rebuild, she knew that the trust between them had been shattered beyond repair. There was nothing more to be done. The familiar smell of coffee filled the air as Lauren stumbled into the kitchen, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She moved mechanically, her hands moving through the motions of making coffee, but her mind was elsewhere. It was as if she were on autopilot, performing the daily rituals of life, while trying to make sense of a world that no longer felt like her own. The ache in her chest, the longing for something that could never be, gnawed at her relentlessly. Lauren hadn't expected this. No one ever does, she thought. When you get married, you don't envision a day where the person you love will look at you and see nothing but the wreckage of your mistakes. She had thought that their love, the bond they had shared, was unbreakable. But what she hadn't realized was that love alone wasn't enough. Trust was the foundation, and she had broken it. She had fractured their relationship beyond the point of recognition, and no amount of wishing could undo what had been done. She thought about the day they had met. Eric, with his easy smile and the way he had made her feel as though she were the most important person in the world. She had been swept up in his warmth, in his genuine affection, in the way he had made her feel seen, heard, and understood. He had been everything she had ever wanted. And in the beginning, their marriage had felt like a dream. Their connection had been effortless, their days filled with laughter, love, and shared dreams for the future. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. The pressure of life, of responsibilities, of small misunderstandings, had slowly eroded the bond they shared. She had made mistakes that had accumulated into something bigger than she had ever anticipated. The affair had been the breaking point, a consequence of years of emotional neglect, of feeling disconnected.
But none of that mattered now.
What mattered was that she had betrayed him, and no amount of regret could undo that betrayal. Lauren took a deep breath and sipped her coffee, trying to steady herself. She knew that there was no going back. Eric was gone, and this chapter of her life was closed. The question now was, what would she do with the knowledge she had gained, with the painful truth that had been revealed over the course of their crumbling marriage? She knew she couldn't remain in this limbo forever. As much as she longed for things to return to the way they once were, she understood now that they never could. The truth was too raw, too painful. She had lost herself along the way, wrapped up in the expectations of others, in her own need for validation, and in the desperate desire to make her marriage work at any cost. In the process, she had sacrificed her integrity, her self-worth, and the very thing that had bound her to Eric in the first place: trust. But now, alone and facing the consequences of her actions, Lauren realized that she had to rebuild herself. Not for Eric, but for her. She had spent so long trying to fix what was broken between them, trying to prove that she could be the person Eric wanted her to be, that she had neglected to be the person she needed to be for herself. It wasn't going to be easy. There was so much to unravel. She had to confront the painful reality that her marriage, the one she had so desperately clung to, was over. She had to accept that no amount of pleading or regret could change what had happened. Eric had made his decision, and she had to respect it, even if it meant walking away from the life they had built together. As the days passed, Lauren began to move through the motions of her life without him. She went back to work, resumed her social activities, and slowly reintroduced herself to the world. But there was a difference now. She wasn't the same person she had been before. The affair, the guilt, the heartache, it had all changed her. She had learned something painful but necessary about herself. She had been hiding. Hiding from her own feelings, hiding from her own mistakes, and hiding from the person she had allowed herself to become. And now, with everything exposed, she had no choice but to face herself head-on. There were moments when she felt as though she were drowning in the weight of her choices, moments when the grief of losing Eric threatened to overtake her completely. She missed him more than she ever thought possible. She missed the way they used to talk, the way they used to laugh, the ease of their connection. But she also realized that she had to let go of that version of their marriage. The person she had been in that relationship was gone, and she couldn't go back to her old self. She had to forge a new path, even if it meant walking alone for a while. Lauren began to spend more time reflecting on the things that truly mattered to her, things she had neglected in the chaos of her marriage. She took up old hobbies, rediscovered passions she had long since abandoned, and sought out the support of friends and family. Slowly but surely, she started to piece together the person she had once been, the person who had been lost in the fog of a toxic relationship. And though she knew it would take time, she began to understand that healing wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about learning to move forward, to grow, and to accept that some things could never be repaired. As the weeks turned into months, Lauren began to feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The bitterness and resentment that had once clouded her every thought started to fade. She realized that, though the pain would never truly disappear, she could learn to live with it, to carry it with grace and dignity. She had made mistakes, and she would carry the consequences of those mistakes for the rest of her life. But that didn't mean she couldn't learn from them, grow from them, and use them to become a stronger, more self-aware person. And as for Eric, she knew that there would always be a part of her that loved him, a part of her that longed for the life they had lost. But she also knew that love, in its truest form, meant letting go. She couldn't keep holding on to a dream that was no longer hers. And while she couldn't control the choices Eric made or how he viewed her, she could control the way she moved forward. In the end, the most painful lesson of all was the truth that had been buried beneath the layers of guilt and regret. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to let go. To accept that the person you loved may no longer be the person you need, and that the relationship you thought would last forever was never meant to be. It was a bitter truth, one that Lauren had fought against for so long. But now, with time and distance, she could see it clearly. The hardest part wasn't losing Eric, it was losing herself. But now, armed with that painful truth, Lauren was ready to step into the future. Not as the woman she once was, but as the woman she was becoming. A woman who had faced her darkest fears, who had learned to live with the weight of her mistakes, and who was ready to move forward, no matter how uncertain the future might be.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.